The prince was invited to come by 10 o'clock that evening, in any case, to make plans for the next day. Despite all consolations and reassurances, a perfect despair overwhelmed the prince's soul. In inexpressible anguish, he reached his inn on foot. The dusty, stifling summer Petersburg squeezed him as in a vice. He jostled among stern or drunken people, aimlessly peered into faces, probably walked much more than he had to. It was nearly evening when he entered his hotel room. He decided to rest a little and then go again to Rogojin's, as he had been advised, sat down on the sofa, rested both elbows on the table, and fell to thinking. God knows how long he thought and God knows what about. There was much that he feared, and he felt painfully and tormentingly that he was terribly afraid. Vera Lebedev came into his head, then it occurred to him that Lebedev might know something about this matter, and if he did not, he would be able to find out sooner and more easily than he would himself. Then he remembered Hippolyte, and that Rogojin had gone to see Hippolyte. Then he remembered Rogojin himself, recently at the burial, then in the park, then, suddenly here in the corridor, when he had hidden himself in the corner that time and waited for him with a knife. His eyes he now remembered, his eyes looking out of the darkness then. He gave a start, the earlier importunate thought now came to his head. It was in part that if Rogojin was in Petersburg, then even if he was hiding for a time, all the same he would end by coming to him, the prince, with good or bad intentions, perhaps, just as then. At least, if Rogojin had to come for some reason or other, then he had nowhere else to come than here, to this same corridor again. He did not know his address, therefore he would very possibly think that the prince was staying at the same inn. At least he would try looking here if he needed him very much. And, who knows, perhaps he would need him very much? So he reflected, and for some reason this thought seemed perfectly possible to him. He would not have been able to account for it to himself, if he had begun to go deeper into this thought. Why, for instance, should Rogojin suddenly need him so much, and why was it even impossible that they should not finally come together? But the thought was painful. If things are well with him, he won't come, the prince went on thinking. He'll sooner come if things are not well with him, and things are probably not well. Of course, with such a conviction, he ought to have waited for Rogozhin at home, in his hotel room, but he was as if unable to bear his new thought, jumped up, seized his hat, and ran. It was now almost quite dark in the corridor. What if he comes out of that corner now and stops me by the stairs? Flashed in him as he approached the familiar spot. But no one came out. He went down under the gateway, walked out to the sidewalk, marveled at the dense crowd of people who came pouring outside at sunset, as always in Petersburg at vacation time, and went in the direction of Gorokhovaya Street. "50 paces from the inn, at the first intersection, in the crowd, someone suddenly touched his elbow and said in a low voice, just at his ear, 'Lev Nikolaevich, come with me, brother, you've got to.' It was Rogozhin. Strange, the prince began telling him, suddenly, with joy, babbling and almost not finishing the words, how he had been expecting him just now in the corridor, at the inn. "I was there," Rogozhin answered unexpectedly. "Let's go." The prince was surprised by the answer, but he was surprised at least 2 minutes later, when he understood. Having understood the answer, he became frightened and began studying Rogozhin. The man was walking almost half a step ahead, looking straight in front of him and not glancing at anyone he met, giving way to them all with mechanical care. "Then why didn't you ask for me in my room if you were at the inn?" the prince asked suddenly. Rogozhin stopped, looked at him, thought, and, as if not understanding the question at all, said, "So, now, Lev Nikolaevich, you go straight on here, right to the house, you know?" "And I'll go along the other side. And watch out that we keep together." Having said this, he crossed the street, stepped onto the opposite sidewalk, looked whether the prince was following, and seeing that he was standing and staring at him, waved his hand in the direction of Gorokhovaya and went on, constantly turning to look at the prince and beckoning to him to follow. He was obviously heartened to see that the prince had understood him and did not cross the street to join him. It occurred to the prince that Rogozhin had to keep an eye out for someone and not miss him on the way, and that was why he had crossed to the other side. Only why didn't he tell me who to look for? They went some 500 paces that way, and suddenly the prince began to tremble for some reason. Rogozhin still kept looking back, though more rarely. The prince could not help himself and beckoned to him with his hand. The man at once came across the street to him. "Is Nastasia Philippovna at your house?" "Yes." "And was it you who looked at me from behind the curtain earlier?" "It was." "Then why did you?" But the prince did not know what to ask further and how to finish the question. Besides, his heart was pounding so hard that it was difficult for him even to speak. Rogozhin was also silent and looked at him as before, that is, as if pensively. "Well, I'm going," he said suddenly, preparing to cross the street again, "and you go, too." "Let's stay separated in the street, it's better for us that way on different sides, you'll see." When they finally turned from two different sidewalks onto Gorokhovaya and approached Rogozhin's house, the prince's legs again began to give way under him, so that he had difficulty walking. It was nearly 10 o'clock in the evening. The windows on the old lady's side were open as before, Rogozhin's were closed, and the drawn white blinds seemed to have become still more noticeable in the twilight. The prince came up to the house from the opposite sidewalk. Rogozhin stepped onto the porch from his sidewalk and waved his hand to him. The prince went up to him on the porch. "Even the caretaker doesn't know about me now, that I've come back home." "I told him earlier that I was going to Pavlovsk, and I said the same thing at my mother's," he whispered with a sly and almost contented smile. "We'll go in and nobody'll hear." He already had the key in his hand. Going up the stairs, he turned and shook his finger at the prince to step more quietly opened the door to his rooms, let the prince in, carefully came in after him, locked the door behind him, and put the key in his pocket.